Well, I always thought it was weird to say welcome to.
I know, it's like, welcome to our home, enter into our space. Well, we are talking about, yesterday we were talking a lot about extimacy. The inside is the outside.
Sure. No, but that, hi, this is estranged.
Right. Okay. So
that's.
Well, we can just imagine. We can ASMR this and be like, you are walking into a house.
We should get one of those head microphones. Have you seen those?
What's that?
It's like the shape of a human head, and it's a microphone.
What?
And it has ears on it.
That sounds
and you
horrible.
Speak into the ears. Yeah, it's very Cronenberg.
Yeah, God, I mean, that's like some kind of installation right there.
Yeah, no,
Maybe
but
we
this
should
is.
Just whisper this podcast.
we should do an ASMR episode and see how that goes.
You sent me the funniest text I've ever received in my entire life the other day.
Oh my God.
What was it in response to? You said you'd prefer to.
We were talking about somebody that I don't particularly like. And I said I'd rather hear an ASMR of someone taking a shit.
Yeah.
Than.
I know. I remember now. Yes.
Than resist, just tolerating this person. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I use this word annoyment, where you enjoy being annoyed, and so I get a lot of perverse enjoyment.
That's enjoyment itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true. But there's a real. I don't know if it's this kind of I enjoy. Putting myself through listening to things I not only disagree with, but viscerally disagree with. I maybe should not do that, but it's fun. But you would rather listen to an ASMR of someone doing a number two than...
No, but that's obviously false, because I would actually listen to this guy, because it's it's very pleasurable in the worst way possible.
Yes, so mysterious.
No, but this is So you're listening to Estranged. This is a podcast that takes apart films that are either within ideology or representing ideology, and we're trying to find sort of the ruptures within these films and to see how they represent our current predicament, which is living in capitalism as millennials.
Yes, okay, that's a nice summary. So we totally rip off Slavoj Žižek, not that we aspire to be anything like the grand master of all things, Daddy Žižek, but in the vein of Pervert's Guide, we take a film each week and use it as a launching pad to have a discussion about theory and ideology.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So this week we're going to talk about a film that I really like. Mm-hmm. You like reluctantly because you don't like horror movies. Mm-hmm. But we think it's a good film. It's not necessarily ripe with theory or it's hard to theorize it, but I think we're going to try our best. But that film is Hereditary. That came out last year.
And I was encouraged by you to go to the cinema to watch it, and I didn't sleep for 4 days. I have problems with nightmares anyway. I have this real kind of presence at night of I just have really visceral dreams and but yeah, my God. And then my boyfriend kept doing the clicking sound. I honestly was so terrified for weeks. Yeah. Well, for 4 days I didn't sleep, but I was but the second time I watched it, I wasn't so scared. But I think I was looking at it more of theoretically rather than kind of viscerally.
The second time. You watched it at the movies the first time?
Watched it at the movies the first time, and became afraid of some shooter coming into the cinema and shooting everything. I don't know. I was really on edge the entire time.
What's the deal with? There's a lot of people that are extreme fans of Toni Collette. I think maybe her subreddit is pretty active, but really? She has a cult following.
She has been in some really good films. She really has.
Little Miss Sunshine.
Yes, Muriel's Wedding.
What was that?
Muriel's Wedding.
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah. Yes.
The Sixth Sense.
Yeah, I mean, she was in Velvet Buzzsaw. Did you watch it?
Yeah, I did.
What did you think?
I thought it was really funny.
Yeah, I was also quite scared by it. It's kind of comedy horror.
I was I don't know.
After watching it.
At some point, I didn't think it was funny at the beginning, but then I started watching really closely Jake Gyllenhaal's acting, and I thought, I think he's trying to make this role funny.
Yeah.
And once I was seeing that, I just couldn't stop laughing because every just the way he acts is hilarious.
I do I can't even remember the guy's name who directed it, and also Nightcrawler. I feel like they have the potential to have been greats.
Yeah.
But they're a little bit fastly produced. I feel like there could have been well, I think like structurally.
You mean the director?
Yeah, no, the films themselves, I felt like they're a bit
Okay.
rushed and kind of, no, I don't want to say slapped.
Yeah.
That's like a really horrible term, but I think that, you know, they have something very brilliant to them, but
Yeah.
that, I mean, I could go into kind of like a technical reason why, but I think that's really boring, but I feel like they're nearly great.
We talked about this the other day. We talked about certain artists like not having a clear idea, and this is a very common trope within artists that they themselves are not completely aware of the the theoretical implications of their work.
It's interesting because I think maybe I'm too much of a heady person, but I have to be in complete control logically of what I'm creating, otherwise I can't do it. And then anything else that emerges kind of in the imaginary realm
Yeah.
is something that emerges from the seed of the idea, but unless I'm completely clear of the single track idea, I can't even start. But I've worked with lots of people, like musicians especially,
Yeah.
from like making music videos, and kind of when we discuss like what the film's about, I have to have like an idea, and then from that, well, anybody can project whatever they want onto the vision that they see, and perhaps there's like a multiplicity of meaning later, but from a like creative point of view, I have to have it like so clear and be like, well, the song's about this and this, but also about this as well. And I'm like, how can you write if you don't? But then maybe that's why I do writing rather than music. Well,
no, yeah, but I think that I think that you have a really good point there, and it's that a really good director is aware that his work lends itself to different interpretations, but he doesn't partake, or he doesn't join the audience in interpreting his own film.
Yeah,
he has like a specific sort of theme that is very clear, or maybe not so clear, but it is clear to him or her, and like people can think whatever they want about it, but there is a line that is like pretty.
I mean, I feel like any technology, and I feel like writing, well, fiction writing, and obviously film are technologies, and they're so complex in the kind of like constellation-y type way that they're made, that then subsequently the clarity of theme is kind of blurred in the very process or form of the technology itself. But I personally, I don't know how, I actually haven't talked to that many other writers and stuff about this thing, but I have to be 100%. And I've, you know, some things that I've written, in retrospect, they haven't worked, and then I realize for me it's because I didn't actually know what I was saying.
Yeah.
Or you know, sometimes I'd be like, I want to say this and this, and this is a great thing, I'll whack it in there, but it has to be all about one thing.
Yeah, I've also talked to some songwriter friends. They write things, and then I ask them what the song's about. Some of them don't know.
Yeah.
Like they'll just say like, yeah, I think it comes from somewhere personal, but I'm not sure what it means or anything. And I think that there's something to having a piece of art that is very clear to the director, even though it lends itself to interpretation for the listener.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder,
Spectator.
you know, what that comes out of, a person who is more kind of logically based rather than sensorial. But yeah, I'm very and it's funny, you know, film, when you are writing and pitching a film, you have to create something called a log line, which is the most arbitrary one sentence summary of what your film is.
Yep.
And it's this really like weird thing that's almost more difficult to do than the actual film itself. And you always miss, it's funny because when I sometimes like summarize something that I've written, for instance, this podcast that you and I both worked on, audiobook, Adrian wrote this amazing music for it, but you could summarize a novel 10 different ways, as in this happens, this character does this is the theme, and they would all be right. But I feel like as a writer, before starting, I have to have this arbitrary one that I have decided is what it's about, and then you know, the kind of the very flourishing of the process, like the technology of fiction writing itself, then lends itself to something more complex than what the writer even thinks in the first place.
Yeah. It's almost like you have to be very strict with yourself so that the audience doesn't have to.
Yeah, well, we were talking about this a lot when we were working on the score for the film that we made last year, Making Love. And I almost feel that the film has to be so, it's on the part of the director to be so precise so kind of anally retentive and like perfectionistic that they create something that is so able to be transmitted in such a visceral way that the audience just receives it in this kind of like wash, and that nothing disturbs them in the viewing process. It's funny because you have things like, you know, Kubrick in The Shining, where there's deliberate continuity errors, and you do sometimes see this in horror films. They kind of like make it an uncomfortable viewing experience by deliberately having continuity errors. I recently saw Suspiria, and there's a scene where Tilda Swinton is smoking a cigarette where it has like the worst continuity errors I've ever seen. And my boyfriend was like, "Oh no, that's deliberate," and I was like, "No, that's just bad." But I don't know. I feel like I'm too much in the imaginary realm. I get too afraid of things. Things are so real for me that horror movies, I just get so affected that I just can't even bear them.
Yeah, because I think you wanted the music to be the same, like very, very punctual towards certain themes, and like I think I was trying to do something that was a little bit more withheld, and it wasn't pointing towards danger or anything, but it's like you were like, no, there's a dangerous moment coming up, like we need to like foreshadow it with the music. And
so I think there's things like any point that a viewer is like, what's happening here, then you've lost them. And I feel like more than a novel, you know, is more. Well, it's funny because like Roland Barthes has this theory of like a readerly or a writerly text. There's lots of things that, you know, I'd agree. I think that like the premise of Roland Barthes, like the death of the author, is like a very important topic in terms of analysing a film or a piece of work. But for me, the participatory experience of film is visceral, and then afterwards come all of these greater kind of elements. And obviously reading is done in the head of the reader, and perhaps it's a very different experience. But yeah, as soon as you have an audience saying, "Oh, what's happening here?" Or there was a scene in the film that I thought that people could get lost when the old man leaves the car. I think that was the bit you were talking about. Yeah, I feel like you really have to kind of point people, because it's in this like short amount of time, and in order for all of the elements of the film to land correctly, they have to have this very kind of clear viewing experience.
Which is okay. So I think that if you have a really good idea, you should be clear about it, but like to the audience, it'll seem complex. Whereas I think that if you have kind of a weak idea, you have to like include yourself in the audience and like think that there's like these open holes and maybe like narrative gaps and whatever.
It's funny because we're going to be talking about Lynch in a later episode. And for me, he's very, 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 very clear. His films are very logical.
But it doesn't come across like that.
Yeah, but because it's so well thought out, then it's almost like it transcends the very logic. He's such a master manipulator of the technique that then it can become. And it's funny because there's so many films that.
Same with Villeneuve.
Yeah, I mean. Oh yeah, I don't know. I was just watching a scene from Prisoners this morning. I just am obsessed with Denis Villeneuve. But yeah, no, I think there's often you see this with like early filmmakers who make like a short film that's quote unquote artistic, and it doesn't, because you know it's almost imitative of, they've seen these great directors do things that are very artistic, but it doesn't work because it has the semblance of being artistic, but at the core there's nothing there.
I think that's the point that I was trying to make. But anyway, we're gonna talk about Hereditary, and
yes.
Which I think that maybe, at least to me, it seems like a film that really knows what the central themes are, but it is kind of mysterious. There are some things about the film that are still kind of enigmatic to me that I don't completely understand.
And I think maybe watching it subsequently, knowing what happens, makes it less scary. And it obviously, when you are, kind of throughout a narrative structure, you have all these series of reveals. You withhold information, and then it all becomes clear as you go. In different genres, withhold in different ways. Like you have a detective genre, and the information, as in what happens, obviously the author's completely aware of who died, how it was done, but the whole process is the reveals are withheld right until the end. And I've seen some films that don't work because the audience loses interest, like the lost object of discovering what's happened is so withheld that you're bored. But this film doesn't make sense until the end. There's kind of a very confusing presentation of facts,
Yeah.
but when you know what happens subsequently, it's like the sense making makes it less scary.
Yeah, it never reveals itself like fully. It's
Yeah.
just by parts, and
Yeah.
you just have like snippets of the story. But do you want to give a quick rundown of the movie, just for people
Okay,
that?
I feel like I'm really doing this for a living and like having to summarize all the time. I'm really bad at it. Maybe I overthink, and I'm like, okay, this happens and this happens. So it is a film about a family. Well, I mean, it's spoilers alert, massive spoilers alert, who are descendants of a woman who is inhabited by Paimon. So yes, the film is about a family who's has a female relative, the mother of Toni Collette and the grandmother of the children, who was inhabited by Paimon.
King Paimon, yeah.
King Paimon.
Excuse me, King Paimon.
I apologize. And she dies. And then this Paimon demon character must find a new human form.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout
a male
human form, or a kind of a healthy human form.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout the film, the family is kind of terrorized by this demon force that eventually finds the form of the son of the family.
Yeah, they're like they have a complete lack of agency.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that happens to them is sort of like predetermined by this coven of. By the way, if you haven't seen this, like this is gonna obviously be very spoiler heavy, but
Yes.
it's predetermined by a coven of witches, and there's death in the family, there's an incapacity for sacrifice, and that all happens because there's a coven of witches or warlocks. Is that like the male equivalent of a witch? A wizard.
That's like in Harry Potter, it's a witch and a wizard. I don't know.
Yeah, I
Men.
think maybe it might be more like.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's interesting you talk about lack of agency, because that is something that happens in a horror movie, but apparent agency is something that's very important in narrative storytelling. And there was a film that we had a disagreement about that you liked that I didn't, that was kind of a critique of capitalism, but I felt it failed on a technique level because the main character didn't have agency. But anyway, we'll talk about that another time. It's sorry to bother you. The film. Anyway, so this film, the reason why I thought it was, well, you raised it as a film that we should discuss.
Yeah, it starts with a model home, because Toni Collette in the movie does these like miniature models of like houses and different types of living spaces, and I think it's somebody else. I read this somewhere, but it's like they pointed out that it's sort of a reflection of who they are, a family without agency. Like they're sort of puppets. That like, because like I think that the models she does also have like these miniature puppets, and they have absolutely no control over what goes on in their lives.
It's interesting because the trope of miniature is a big thing in narrative storytelling. Films that are to do with fate. Something like, have you seen Atonement?
Yeah.
Yeah, Atonement opens with a miniature house of the house, and it's all about kind of the woman coming to terms with what happened and rearranging a story from kind of like a master puppeteer position. So yeah, films that are to do with fate, it is kind of a trope. And it's interesting about the idea of fate and how this force, otherworldly force, plays its part in influencing and shaping their lives, and maybe that has something to do with the unconscious.
Which is why this movie is scary in the first place, because it's being played to an audience that cherishes the illusion of agency, and I think this movie sort of points to a rupture again. That's why it's horrific, because it you see this family that at the end of the movie, there's this scene where Toni Collette tries to sacrifice herself for her husband and can't even do that.
Yeah, ends up killing him.
Like you would think that maybe sacrifice is something that would maybe break the spell or something, or something that would dispel whatever like conjuring or something that's going on with them. But she can't even do that. Like even her like consideration to sacrifice her own life, she doesn't have agency over giving up her own life. And I think that's like a really, really horrifying thing for our times, in which like our agency sort of, or the illusion of our agency is put on a pedestal, and it's a true commodified thing.
It's interesting because we have in the past this idea, certainly in America, and more kind of Calvinistic cultures like the UK, this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and people coming to the realization, well, no, as in the notion we have of meritocracy doesn't exist. It's not to say that that's something that is a good thing, meritocracy, but certainly there are other forces at play, and but the correctives that are kind of being discussed at the moment aren't really. Are more to do with replacing who's sitting at the table rather than looking at the table and thinking that there's another formation of the table entirely, or turning over of the table. It's interesting, this kind of horrifying idea of there's something other going on than us being pure rational beings who are in control of our own lives. Interestingly, there were kind of two things we wanted to talk about today. One of them was the idea about how belief works. And that's more of a kind of audience-based response to horror films. And then the nature of the unconscious and the real within the film itself, how the real warps our experience of life. So I was thinking the first one maybe we should talk about is the idea that even though we live in this kind of time of the death of God and non-belief, the way audiences respond to horror shows how belief operates in us. So I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, the idea that you don't have to believe in ghosts to be afraid of them. We all know that, the devil doesn't exist. And yet we still have this horrific, visceral response to a film, not being able to sleep. I genuinely believed that Paimon was clicking his tongue in my kitchen for days afterwards, but I don't really believe in anything. So, and it's how ideology works as well. It's not, I think this is a way that we differ from kind of the liberal or progressive perspective that might see things like patriarchy as a structure that is a thing that needs to be overcome. But we would see ideology as, you used a good word, warp, rather than an actual thing. As in, it doesn't have to exist like ghosts for us to still psychically respond or formulate ourselves around it.
It's an insistence.
It's an insistence. Capitalism is an insistence rather than something that exists.
Yeah. And I think that the way that the film works is that there's something controlling their lives, but they feel like it, as if they have lost some kind of agency. Now, the reflection in real life is that the horror is a warp itself, because the reality is that we don't really have agency. But this insistence that we might be able to have agency is definitely the way that I think the real works, which is this horrific sort of thing that doesn't exist, but yet sort of constitutes some kind of discontinuity within the texture of reality.
It's interesting because my boyfriend and I had a kind of a discussion about this in relation to this film, Sorry to Bother You, which is obviously the premise of this film. That film is about, being within a capitalist system, you don't have agency. And the narrative structure of film as a technique and storytelling as a technique speaks to us in a way that we kind of want to hear, which is that we do have agency. You have somebody in it as a character who overcomes or doesn't overcome or reaches a goal or doesn't reach a goal by the end of the story, and they move towards it and learn something throughout that process. And in order to say something about agency, you have to use that kind of opposite structural point in order to be able to express it. So films like Fight Club do it in an interesting way, where they use different characters other than the very bland main character to take action. And this film, horror films, do it in an interesting way, where I guess this family is trying to find out what is happening to them by the end of the story, and they do kind of appear to take actions towards that goal. Even though they're.
I
It's
think
both themselves and not themselves. This this element outside of themselves.
Yeah, this is the way that I would put it in a nutshell. And I think it harkens back to what we were talking about Jordan Peterson. And it's like he talks about this culture of Marxism, this sort of big machine, conspiratorial machine that is in control of the academic world and everything. But obviously that doesn't exist. If you're a Marxist in the academy, it's probably not going to go very well for you anyway.
Yeah, you probably won't be able to actually say anything.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this in one of the previous episodes of like the investment in the subject supposed to know. So in the belief that there is something, some kind of absolute, some subject in the know that controls everything. And as we can clearly see in Hereditary, the coven is absolutely not absolute. What they're hoping for is more wisdom, more health for their family, possibly more wealth. Like they're obviously lacking subjects that want
and that's
more.
almost what's like more horrific, is finding out that the subject supposed to know doesn't exist.
Exactly.
It's horror. It's, you know, the death of God is profoundly frightening.
Yeah.
And talking about Jordan Peterson and talking about just this idea I was talking about with the technology of film. There's a kind of a screenwriting expert who I do really, really respect, but he was giving a talk that I heard, and he said, "Oh well, we're currently in an era of storytelling that's very Freudian. We need to move towards a Jungian storytelling." And I actually think that the technique of storytelling is very Jungian.
Yeah.
And in order to do something Freudian, you have to manipulate it in a very clever way. And we need to move towards Freudian. And there's actually, I think very few Freudian storytellers and filmmakers out there. And the reason why Jordan Peterson is so interested in Disney films is that they are
completely
Jungian. And that is the co-opting, like that Jungian perspective of balance, that there's a lesson to be learned that then you can improve through, is what we believe as a society still.
Yeah. What did you think about the music in Hereditary? Did you know that?
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember about the music so much, but this is by this guy called Stetson. I think Chris Stetson. Did you know that he just plays like sax?
Yeah.
Like trumpet. I don't know if he plays trumpets, but like woodwind instruments and all that stuff. I thought that was very interesting.
I really liked the final scene. It's funny because it's very churchy, and that's what the element I liked most about Interstellar was the churchy organ music and that kind of like holy music at the end.
Yeah.
Final scene I really liked.
It's very sort of like it has some kind of reverence. It's very, very religious at the end.
It's very religious, yeah. I have to say, I do remember it has this very disturbing heartbeat kind of rhythm through it that's like very excessive and intrusive. And I found it annoying the second time I watched it, but the first time I was obviously completely captivated and frightened, so it did its job.
Yeah, there's these parts where I don't know what they're called, but there's like these kind of horns that are very, very old.
Oh, what, like French horn?
No, like
Anglais?
they're made out of like bone, and they have like they're like they have a curve to them, and
what, like as in like an actual horn?
You can't even pitch control them. It's just like
just a thing they just go like, oh, is that
like,
what they
it sounds kind of they use that a couple of times in the film, and it's horrifying.
Yeah, it's very I mean, the whole film is so disturbing. It's funny because we talked about La La Land. La La Land is almost more disturbing, but this is just disturbing in a different way. And I wonder what the different ways are. But
I also thought about like the definition of what is a villain.
That's the coffee machine.
The definition of what it is to be a true villain. And I told you about the difference between, for example, the Joker in The Dark Knight, where, Michael Caine talks about the Joker. It's like, you shouldn't mess with this guy. He's a complete lunatic. Like, he only really wants to watch the world burn. But I don't think that's as scary. It seems to me like that's more like mental illness than evil.
It's true, because
in Hereditary, the coven is like at the expense of a family. They're asking for wealth and health and like wisdom and all that stuff. That seems to me like true evil.
Yeah, they want something out of something else, as opposed to just
relatively good things.
Yeah, I mean, that is conflict. The world is full of conflict. People. I think that is something that is very repressed in the contemporary scene. We kind of think that there's, we'll all get along. As long as we're nice to X group, we'll all get along. But life is conflict. People's desires are conflictual.
Yeah.
And we're not very good with that.
Yeah.
It's quite something that we don't want to admit. It's something that we have to learn as children. The first no of the father is what generates a sense of self, what generates language. And in order to interact with other people, we have to have the possibility to negotiate the reality principle.
Yeah.
It's almost like we want to overcome the reality principle. And in order to do that, all we have to do is be nice to people.
But interestingly enough, I think we agree with this, is that the reality principle is precisely what generates enjoyment.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to talk about the difference between pleasure and enjoyment?
Yes. So there's a difference between pleasure and enjoyment in the sense that enjoyment is the repetition of the lost object. So I think that, I'm not the greatest at explaining this, but I think that when you come into consciousness, there's something that you sort of give up. Not something that you actually had, but you sort of accept this lack, that you don't have something that you feel like you were at one with at some point before in your life, which you never were, but it feels like that. And the interesting thing is that people want to continue to desire. They don't actually want to get the thing that they want. So enjoyment comes from the repetition of that loss, like feeling like you're really close to that object, but unconsciously knowing that it doesn't exist, and then experiencing the horrific loss or the disappointment of just falling short of that.
Yeah, so absolutely.
And pleasure, and pleasure is just like, you want a pizza and you go get a pizza and it tastes good.
This is the thing. There's texturally different kinds of. I don't want to use either the word pleasure or enjoyment because they're such technical terms of getting something one wants.
Yeah.
Yeah, and enjoyment is really how we orientate ourselves around the lost object. And the lost object is that thing which we believe is going to return us to this oneness of kind of conjuring up the desire of our primary caregiver, or like returning to the womb, basically. But that place never existed. Yep. And we never were ourselves in that place. It was like pre-being a person. And we don't want to actually attain that lost object, because if we get it, we realize it won't exist. And enjoyment is that kind of revolving around the fantasy of being able to attain that thing.
Yeah.
But that thing doesn't exist.
It's the language of death drive.
Yes.
Don't you think that it's very interesting that in Hereditary, they want to gain wisdom and health and wealth and whatever because they're lacking beings, and doesn't it make perfect sense that they are going for the transcendent? I think I've heard Zizek say this before, that I've heard Zizek say that death drive isn't the desire to die. It's a desire for transcendence, something that will give ultimate meaning to your life.
It's interesting you say that death drive is the desire for transcendence, and transcendence is this ability to give up agency, to be an acting self. It's almost like
to King Paimon.
Exactly. Well, it's like when you were in the womb, you didn't exist. It was a void. It was a nothingness. But this kind of, I am a pre-language baby. I don't know what I want, I cry. I'm told I want this and I'm given it. Oh, you're hungry, eat. Oh, you're tired, sleep. And it's this, the subject's supposed to know, tells us both what we want and gives us the solution to it. Yeah. But the thing is, our parents, they don't have a fucking clue either. So, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So it's kind of a death. It's like the idea of Sleeping Beauty. Why is she asleep? She's like this beautiful woman who doesn't have to do anything. I mean, there's certain feminist readings of Sleeping Beauty, but I don't partake of those. But I think the idea is this kind of like, it represents the idea that if you're such a beautiful, special person, you don't have to do anything. Yeah. But it's not good. You're dead. And you're right, like pre-life is death. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, it is interesting that you put it in these terms, because I would kind of argue that liberalism is towards a teleology, this kind of this transcendent utopia that we can achieve. But that's death. It doesn't exist because we are like the moths banging against the lampshade of the light, and eventually we just kill ourselves in doing it.
Yeah, it's so what you're saying is like before life there is death, and the only thing that we believe that can deliver us to that primordial death is the transcendent. Is that right?
It doesn't exist. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
It's interesting, we're talking about La La Land and the idea of the universe, and that the universe has been co-opted by New Age kind of religions, or the universe told me to do this, the universe will take care of me, the universe has the answer. The universe is a void. There's nothing there. I mean, if we entered the universe, we'd just be like obliterated.
Yeah.
Explode.
Yeah. Even though I don't really believe in all this stuff, like, the demons and all that, I got into it. I mean, I researched into it.
Why not?
Into King Paimon, and it's a real, it's a real mythological figure. There's actually a Reddit, a subreddit.
Yeah.
I'm not sure for him, but I think there's one called Three Kings, and like another one just for the occult. And basically, they did like pretty good research because King Paimon is one of, I don't know, maybe like 4 different kings. I think there's one for north, east, west, and south. Maybe Connor Habib, if he ever listens to this.
Yeah, we have a friend who's into witchcraft, so I'll have to ask him.
I might be totally wrong about this, but there's apparently like people that do all these like ritualistic practices of like, you have this circle of salt, and you have like these candles, and like there's a lot of people that actually write like, witness stories of like, I did this ritual. And I was visited by King Paimon, or I was visited by the Three Kings, and like...
Yeah, I'm sure it's like very real. I mean, people have visions, people experience transcendent moments, people experience the divine. But, I don't want to say it's like biological explanation, but I feel like, yes, we can dissolve our egos in certain moments, and a double 6 can be rolled, and certain experiences can appear to be divine. I mean, I certainly have had experiences that I couldn't explain, and then ended up doing stupid things because believing a magical thing had happened.
Right, and this is one of the things that we were talking about. It's just like there are certain philosophers that are possibly most likely atheist, but they're sort of struggling to bring into the fore of philosophy the idea of the transcendent. And the thing is that like we at the same time desire to get in touch with the transcendent through our death drive, but immediately after the transcendent possibly erupts into our reality, we cover over it, or we repress it through a narrative that has to do with a specific religion, like the occult or Christianity or whatever. So that's not facing up to the transcendent. That's actually covering over it.
It is interesting. I mean, I had a moment that I felt was divine when I was about 21, and then subsequently got into Jungianism.
Yeah, you named it.
Yeah. And you're right. And the thing is that actually, so we are beings of excess. We feel jouissance, we feel excess, and explanation, which is this kind of this supplementary I don't know even what I would call it, that emerges out of language.
Or something.
Yeah, that emerges out of language, that is something that we do paper over with explanations.
Yeah.
And so we talk like a religion is something that makes an explanation out of the divine, rather than accepting that these things can happen and they're profoundly moving and seem completely illogical.
Yeah.
And they kind of paper over it. It's funny because I was talking about dating with my youngest sister. My youngest sister is currently dating. And it's painful.
Yeah.
The unknowing, the having to go on, does he like me? Does he not? You feel this painful excess of unknowing. And the way to get rid of it is to get married. So we always find, people go on diets because they can't bear the freedom of eating. Eating is this profoundly traumatic thing. We have to find ways of not having to think about this drive of eating. You kind of like harness it by being like, okay, I only eat keto, or I eat vegan, or I don't eat before this time. And it's a way that you don't have to deal with kind of the complex excess of how do you deal with food. Or people like ritualize sex, because sex itself is like really excessive and horrible.
Yeah.
Like routines are almost a way to not to have to deal with the excesses of life.
Yeah. What do you think that? I mean, I think that we then both agree that one of the things that, well, it's not a theological solution, definitely not. And I think this will go against the point. But I think maybe something that could help the way that we experience life is a disinvestment from any type of solution. You know, like, and this is why, and this is very interesting because I think it's a double back that Meyasu is doing when he's like trying to theorize the transcendent, is that complete unknowing. It's just like, don't put a name on it. It's not about Christianity. It's not about any kind of religion. It's not about any kind of like mystical thing. It's just transcendent for the sake of transcendence. It might be fractured, but there is this, like, in order for you to come to terms with that sort of transcendence, there's a giving up of any type of name that you might put into it.
Absolutely.
And I think, what is that? So what is that to you? Like, just the disinvestment from the name.
It's interesting. By the way, so Adrian was just talking about Quentin Meyasu, who's kind of a younger philosopher from France whose field is speculative realism. No, actually, that's what's it? Something realism. What is it? I'm gonna have to Google it, because speculative realism is like a form of
correlative correlationism.
I should have looked at it.
I mean, he's trying to disprove correlationism.
Yes, but there's a form of yes, speculative materialism. Okay, yes, speculative realism is like a form of sci-fi or something, I think.
Yeah,
I don't know. But yeah, no, so
I think it's like close to, I mean, I know Graham Harman is like one of the main guys there, and I think it's relatively close to like object-oriented ontology, the triple O thing.
So the idea of excess, yeah, I think that a lot of divine, I don't know if divine is the right word, but transcendent experiences, strange experiences, moving experiences can be explained logically. But in logically naming them, yeah, you are kind of papering over the fact that they reveal some kind of element of the real. So a friend recently had an experience where he visited a shaman and took mushrooms and had this amazing, but it's like, to me, it's like, well, yeah, you got like a dopamine dump in your brain. Yeah, of course it's amazing. Of course you feel amazing. Of course you see things differently. But then almost by like papering, by saying that, it's doing exactly the same as being like, oh, well, you know, the divine visited you and that's the explanation.
Yeah. I think I told you about this before, but I had a friend that told me about just an experience he had, that he took mushrooms and together with his girlfriend, and then that he had this experience where like he was obviously high, and then he turned to his girlfriend and then realized, I don't like her. Like I actually hate this woman. I don't want to be with her. And then once the high was over, he broke up with her. And I think that what Meyasu is trying to get at is like, there's this openness before it has a name, before there's a reason for it. Because obviously, if you're taking mushrooms in order to, like, I don't know, expand your consciousness or whatever, you're already looking for an answer. And regardless of what happens, like in your brain, when you're taking mushrooms or whatever, if you have that predisposition for an answer, something's obviously going to change in your life.
When you're going to like look for something to change. I mean, this is why I had,
which will ultimately be completely disappointing.
And I guess that, this is the dichotomy between atheism and theism. That like atheism isn't the answer either. Like a focus on logic, or that also is papering over everything. But it is also why I have a personal problem with religions of New Age. They function just as much, just like any organized religion. And from personal experience, seeing certain kinds of therapists to deal with my problem, doing like past life regressions, it really, as you said, this friend of yours who kind of almost arbitrarily, oh, my girlfriend's the problem, this is what I experienced, and the first thing I turn to is my girlfriend, and I break up with her. I took so many decisions based on this logic of past life regressions that damaged me so much. But I don't, I wouldn't resort just to pure logic, but I am a very, very logical person. But at the same time, it's just interesting how those two things, how lots of things that we think are more spiritual are completely not. They function as a way of papering over some quote unquote spiritual experience.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why Peter has a lot of followers that maybe they idealize him or whatever, but I think that Peter's really tapping into this tradition that is saying like we need a healthy dose of unknowing, which is it points to the gap. It points to like a sort of a gap in the sequence of reality, a gap in the sequence of signifiers that we all partake on. I don't know. I just feel like there's not a lot of people talking about that. Like, I mean, right now we're in LA. I'm not from here, but like, there's an excess of belief, and it's not. People think that belief that is not religious is not belief. It absolutely is
almost
belief.
More religious than religion itself. This is why I love LA, because it is, for me, it's like there's no place. There's nothing. It's like the end of fantasy. It's a complete shithole in many places. It's like a desert city with like, it's kind of ugly. There's nothing here, and that's why I like it. I just love the grit, the grime, the shittiness, the dirt. I love these kind of like broken dreams. It's kind of like it's like a Beach Boys song on the surface. It's this la 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 lovely 1960s sunshine, but they're like profoundly sad lyrics. That's why I kind of like it. But it is a place that is full of belief. But I kind of feel like if you can kind of like avoid that, then it's kind of really fascinating. And I have loads of friends who hate LA for that very reason, because they think it's this excessive, that people are obsessed with their work and fame, and I feel like it's kind of almost the opposite of that. But you're right. There are. It's the place that the center for Scientology, the ultimate religion of getting what you want on a material level in this world. There is a people visit psychics 24. And the thing is, visit a psychic or don't visit a psychic. Who cares?
Yeah.
It's neither correct or not correct.
Yeah.
In fact, well, it's not correct, but you can still get some like experience that might help you if you want to. But
Yeah, but there's this like eerie openness to things that are not even really that are underdeveloped. Like I don't know. I was talking to a friend the other day of acupuncture, and the word that she uses, like, I told her very, very carefully, kind of skeptical. It's like, hey, have you thought about acupuncture? And she was like, oh, I totally believe in that stuff. And she used the word believe. It's like, obviously, I think that there's some kind of like meltdown of belief that is redoubling the power or the force that people have to believe in something. And I have a lot of friends that are just like becoming even more conservative because obviously if you feel like if you lost something, you want to regain some primordial thing from the past that you feel like you've lost. But
I guess what you're talking about is like the dialectic of belief. An amazing film I would recommend people watch is The Party by a director called Sally Potter, an English director. She did an amazing adaptation of Orlando by Virginia Woolf with Tilda Swinton in the 90s. But in this film, a character is a very skeptical character who says, scratch an aromatherapist and you find a fascist. And I think, any belief system works in the same way. There's René Girard talks about this a lot, the scapegoat mechanism in any kind of belief system in order to paper over the real and the antagonism that exists in reality. You have a scapegoat, and in veganism it might be red meat, or I don't know. Not trying to, but again, that doesn't mean like veganism is necessarily bad, but it can function as a belief that requires a scapegoat. And so and anything in a sense that's orientated towards like a teleological end is, by definition, some kind of belief system that papers over the antagonism. So this is why liberalism also scapegoats.
Yeah. And thinking back on the previous episode, where we were talking about the difference between 68 and liberals, that's why I don't think, and I think you agree, that 68 doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
Actually, because 68 has become so embedded into a teleological hope, and nothing really has happened because it's impossible. There is no like big ending, big closure that is possible, people have resorted to liberal sort of like self-policing and the policing of others. That's what it ends up in. But do you think that it's possible then for like people to really start to practice disinvestment from any type of belief?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. I think it's very difficult.
Everybody would have to go to psychoanalysis.
Yeah. No, I really do think it is. And, you know, there are people who are very, very brave in 68 and Martin Luther King and people who, you know, the Vietnam War was, you know, there's certain things that really did need to change, and, you know, there were lots of repression. But again, we'll do an episode about repressions, because repression is also a kind of conflictual thing that's both good and bad at the same time. But, you know, people were excluded. But what were they excluded from? Yep. Well, capitalism. What has happened post 68 sexual revolution? Sex has become so ubiquitous that it, you know, so commercialized. Ads start, you know, sex was what was used to sell post 68, that we, like, millennials don't have sex anymore. Yep. Sex is so unsexy. It's been completely, you know, that's by dint of lessening repressions around sex. But that was kind of the idea that perversion would be the answer. But I just don't think it is. But not to say that 68 shouldn't have happened at all. You know, it was necessary at a time, but we're at a very, very different moment. And those elements of rebellion in 68 have been co-opted to such an extent that there's a different response is required now.
No, I think it's definitely a dialectical process, because I think that the spirit of 68 has been taken to such an extreme that it requires its opposite to continue.
Well, I mean, and the thing is, it's like one doesn't want to fall into the trap of like there's certain YouTubers and commentators online who say like conservatism is the new punk or something, because that's not a response either. But those two sides.
No. I don't mean in the sense of like a left and right. Yeah. Just the idea that I think there was a clear sort of investment into some kind of theological resolution with 68. That I think its opposite would be a disinvestment that eventually maybe not in a sort of resolution way, but it continues the spirit of 68.
Yeah. No, you're right. And this is a figure of the rebel in Camus that is so important. And, you know, I just find it so frustrating, you know, in political terms at the moment, where you have two sides of what are exactly the same coin to me, both capitalists, both completely imbued with contemporary ideology. And one is saying slightly different thing, like include people, and one is like be a bit more traditional. But it's basically the same thing. If you were to kind of like boil everything down to that, you know, it's the same thing. But Camus' figure of the rebel is somebody that's outside of the system itself. And not that, you know, the contrarian position is always the correct one, but there's an element of truth in it. You know, it's not about being a revolutionary against a system that exists and then just flipping it over and having the same thing but different.
Yep.
It's within one's action, being aware of what is not working and trying to do one's best.
Yep.
With the knowledge that one has to not maintain a process that is potentially harmful. I mean, one of the reasons I think that one of the tricks that capitalism pulled so well is to do with globalization, and how we have shipped off our scapegoat to the third world. Like we're not presented with the underside of capitalism anymore. Like they were. One of the periods of greatest economic and social change was during the Industrial Revolution in places like Britain. By dint of there being this really kind of profoundly traumatic vision within the country itself of these factories, these children working in factories, 14-hour days, things like the weekend were introduced, children's rights, school, women's rights. But we don't see any of that. We don't see the children in Congo mining cobalt for our phones. Yeah. But Apple is, it's so sleek, and it's so into social justice. It's so great. And there's this dangling of something apparently good, but completely masking over what the actual antagonism is.
Yeah. So would you say then that maybe the the opposite of naming something in order to repress the transcendent would be contrarianism, because contrarianism doesn't really belong to the left or to the right.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
It's just sort of like the momentum.
I would say, rather than contrarianism, like rebellion, potentially.
Oh, well, now I remembered Hillary Clinton saying that she's now a part of the resistance. Do you remember that?
Sorry, I'm just closing my eyes and having a moment.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, yeah.
I mean, you also get like Disney, Rogue One, the Star Wars thing is just like completely based on like resistance, and but it's very, very, obviously the name of that is like the Force, which would translate into some kind of super invested hope.
Some kind of like westernization of some kind of like quote unquote Eastern. Yeah. I mean, I think that's possibly why we have the situation that we have, is the lack of recognition by the Democratic Party of the actual antagonisms at play, the scapegoats of a certain disempowered demographic, and the idea that they are the goodies.
Yeah.
Rather than it being much more like the whole issue being located somewhere else. But it's a desperate desire not to confront the tragedy of a contemporary situation, and things like credit has been a very clever way for capitalism to continue without us confronting it. The mortgage crisis, 2008, was, essentially there's no growth. So how do we generate excessive growth? Oh, we have speculation in property. So now the mortgage, and now we have credit cards and student loans and credit and car loans.
Yeah.
Credit is a way of like delaying the an acknowledgement of the real antagonisms at play. But at some stage, they have to be recognised. And the more you paper over, but it's. I think part of this love trumps hate was such a great Freudian slip on their part. That the scapegoat, they had to create the scapegoat to generate this belief system that like, as long as we just. They love hating on Trump because Trump is the perfect
almost kind of
excuse not to change anything.
Yeah, almost like I had this kind of altercation with this I like her. I mean, I consider her a friend on Twitter, but she put this post of I forgot, this Muslim activist, and a woman came up to them, and she was very angry, obviously kind of like a Trump supporter type. And the Muslim guy just like started to chant in her face together with the rest of the room, like, "We love you," like just like shouting at her, like, "We love you," which obviously was like the act. The words were saying "I love you," but the act was just like, shut up. It's very similar to what we were talking about before of like Shia LaBeouf and just like "You will not divide us," just like shouting with like just like
desperation,
out of rage, like this guy.
Yeah,
just like,
you're absolutely right. The action rather than the word. Yeah, it's like the texture of it is shut up.
I mean, he's obviously dividing himself from this guy's like worldview. I mean,
no dialogue,
not that there should
shouting.
be like, obviously in some cases like discourse is over.
Yeah.
But like obviously there was some kind of divide between him and her, between the other guys. Like you will.
Well, you're
like,
absolutely right. The censoring is a way, and I'm not saying that I support at all the people who are being censored.
Yeah.
But it's just textually or symbolically a sign of how we are papering over the antagonism, and maybe not listening to the actual logic, but listening to the pain of people who are resorting to certain positions in order to understand. But the love trumps hate is just, it's just, as long as we get rid of the basket of deplorables, or we'll continue on in our perpetual pursuit of this perfect world.
Yeah.
And they need the love of Trump in order to maintain their fantasy of the utopian capitalistic world that will eventually arise, apparently.
So basically the takeaway is that life sucks.
No, but it's an accepting the powerlessness.
It's falling in love with the fact that life sucks.
I feel like life can only exist. We're talking about happiness and what is happiness, and this, we mistake our happiness in the pursuit of happiness rather than just being happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Happiness is work, it's connection with other people, it's being.
Yeah.
And we can just miss being happy our entire lives in the pursuit of something else.
I'm not sure that a lot of people are going to get this from watching Hereditary if they haven't.
Well, yes, it's a very loose jumping off point.
Yeah.
But
All right.
well, we'll leave it there, and until next time.
All right.
Goodbye.
Bye.